A while back, there was some dubious and interesting studies, and whether you want to go into the propaganda conspiracy or not, there was a lot of information put out about how deadly and neurotoxic, and how if you took MDMA, or ecstasy as they called it, it would just melt your brain immediately. It was kind of this idea that came about. And even when the discussion came up with, people in my parents' generation, somehow this information traveled all across the world, and everybody thought, oh, MDMA, eat your brain, And so that was some of the uphill battle that was the climate that you guys started. How have you seen that start to shift after you guys have done some of this research and some of these clinical trials?
Well, it shifted radically. It's really remarkable, the change in attitudes, even in the last several years. It's been gradual. But, finally, I think a couple things. There was the holes in the brain misleading pictures that they, scanned pictures.
And if I was right, they were actually testing a different methamphetamine with that study, or how was that? How did that come about? What was the mistake?
That was the second thing. There were lots of things, but I guess in broad strokes, there was the whole thing about holes in the brain, which was, it was scans of blood flow reflecting blood flow, and they just basically, as I understand it, they just turned the gain up to make it more dramatic, but they represented it as if those were actually anatomical holes.
Like it was eating away those parts of your brain, rather than scuttling blood flow to different parts. Maybe parts that made you feel better and open your heart. Maybe those parts.
Yeah,
using the picture.
Temporary shifts in blood flow.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of people got scared by that. Then the second thing was when George Riccardi at Johns Hopkins published a study saying MDMA caused dopamine toxicity. It was published in Science. And based on that, we lost our first IRB approval. So we had FDA approval, we had IRB approval, we were working on DEA approval. And then when that Riccardi study came out, the IRB got concerned and withdrew the approval.
Because the press took that and just ran with it.
They ran with it. Well, there was there were press releases. There was a lot of media attention brought on by the journal itself. Science.
That it would cause Parkinson's.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it came out sometime later. Were you guys part of that uncovering process when it?
No, we were pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. Well, and what was it? It came out that it wasn't actually MDMA that was tested.
You had written an article. You and Rick had written a letter to Nature.
We had responded to the Nature
was it Nature?
Article.
Yeah, Nature. Yeah.
Nature. Science. Science. It was in Science. We responded with a letter that was published saying, there's something funny here. This doesn't really add up. For one thing, there's no other evidence of this. And for the other thing, if, 20% of the baboons and squirrel monkeys died from the injections of supposedly MDMA. And we said, we probably would have heard about it if 20% of people at raves were dying every weekend.
Maybe. Yeah.
But there was...
Or had Parkinson's.
And then
developed Parkinson's.
People were saying, oh, now there's going to be a big epidemic of Parkinson's.
Right.
So it was about a year later that they published a retraction. And they said, oops, the bottles were mislabeled. We didn't give MDMA at all. We gave methamphetamine, which is a prescription medicine.
Yeah.
Known to cause dopamine toxicity.
Right.
So when it was MDMA, this is a disaster. We're going to have an epidemic of Parkinson's. When it was suddenly methamphetamine, a prescription medicine, that didn't seem to be a concern anymore.
So this is either the most unlucky accident in all of science, or there's something that's a little bit fishy here. Which we don't have to go too deep into it. But if you had a coin to bet and you had to put it on a really unlucky accident or something a little fishy, which way would you push your coin?
I would push it toward really unlucky accident.
Yeah, all right.
I don't think these are smart people, and it was bound to come out eventually.
Yeah.
But what I would say is the way it was presented without any skepticism on their part, when we raised skepticism, they dismissed it. It looks to me, I don't know, of course, but it looks to me as if they were kind of blinded by their mission to show how harmful MDMA was with millions of dollars of funding from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So I don't know.
And why didn't the reviewers pick it up too?
Yeah, there was a lot of concern.
The reviewers that reviewed the article.
Looks like you might be pushing the coin a little bit more on the fishy
that's
side.
another part of it. Like, where is the scientific rigor?
Right.
Looking at these things.
Well, obviously, if they published a positive story, it would have been less funding, less attention. The media probably wouldn't have picked it up because the climate was so anti-MDMA, anti-drug at that point. But they created this finding, and it truly, it seemed like every news organization picked it up. And it became a massive, massive story. And and it's one of those things like, you watch those kind of fictionalized courtroom dramas and someone says, just like when you murdered those other people, right? And then, objection, Your Honor. Like, will the jury strike that from their memory? Like, what? What do you mean you can't strike it from your memory? You just said he murdered those other people. Like, it's in my head. I can't, the memory doesn't work like that. We're not computers, And for a lot of people, that's been this idea that they still can't get out of their head, that there's, and I think obviously you guys have done it absolutely impeccably the right way to start to show that other path. And I think so, let's cover that here for anybody who still has those thoughts or anything rambling around in their head. What have you seen with the vast multitude of patients that you guys have worked with? What is the safety of MDMA, short and long term, that you guys have discovered?
Well, we haven't worked with a vast number, so our numbers are
for clinical research,
small. But we've now, in the MAP studies, there have been 107 people in the PTSD studies. There have been over 1,600 people in clinical trials, including many other more phase 1 trials. So,
but the important thing is that times the number of times they've taken MDMA. Is it a large number of MDMA sessions?
Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So we've done neuropsychological testing before and after, and found no evidence of any decline in neuropsychological function before and after placebo and before and after MDMA. So it seems very clear in terms of neurotoxicity that these kinds of doses range in small numbers of doses. We haven't found any problem with that. Doesn't mean there couldn't be some effect if people take lots of it often or something like that. And like anything else, MDMA does have risks. But what we've seen is it has a good risk-benefit ratio. We've seen a lot of evidence of benefit, and the risk has been low. So,
any medicine can turn into a poison if not taken in the appropriate dose and the appropriate frequency. I remember I had an acute liver toxicity because I accidentally took. I was thinking I was taking a nose cold medicine and a painkiller, but the nose cold medicine had acetaminophen in it, and so I doubled up on the amount of Tylenol, and I was sick. Had jaundice, like my eyes turned yellow. I was horribly sick for like 2 weeks, right? And
deadly.
I think it kills just under 1,000 people a year, acetaminophen toxicity. And that's just this common medicine. There's baby Tylenol. We're giving this to infants, and at the same time, it's killing a lot of people. So medicine to poison is really on an arc where at a certain point, here we go, minimum effective dose, it becomes medicine, and then continue along that arc, and pretty much everything becomes poison.
Right.
Except, things like marijuana, it seems like you could pretty much consume a lot before you reach that arc. The LD50 for that is like giant, like filling a room full of marijuana and forcing you to eat your way out of the room or something, something like that.
I think you'd probably fall asleep before you die.
Or you'd get really, really paranoid some way through. Yeah, for sure. All right, so safety, excellent safety data, but that's only the entry of this story. The real story is the massive, paradigm shifting benefits that you guys are showing in treatment, particularly of PTSD. I remember we had a dinner at my house with Sanj, and he was, showing some of the reduction in that trauma score. And it was like, okay, here's the conventional treatment, reduction, and here's the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy treatment. And you look at those and you're like, we're not even playing in this isn't the same sport. This is a whole different ball game entirely. This is a whole stratosphere. This is another dimension that we're dealing with. So what are those, for people who don't know, what's the difference between MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and the conventional psychiatric approach?
Well, for one, I do want to say, for some people, the existing treatments can be very effective, but the problem is, for a large percentage of people, I would say at least half, they don't respond to existing treatments, and the people we've studied so far have been people that have failed the other treatments. So even though they've, in most cases, failed a lot of treatments, with MDMA, 83% is what we saw no longer had PTSD anymore after 2 MDMA sessions a month apart. So it seems to be a very powerful catalyst for the therapeutic process. Unlike other drugs, we're not just studying drug treatment, we're studying MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So it's the way that MDMA acts as a catalyst is very, very impressive.
Yeah, and looking at, even Rick's presentation at the start of this conference showing that it's not only that during the treatment times that the trauma score and their trauma is reduced, over time it continues to reduce. So it sets this positive cascade of healing, of self-healing, that continues to carry on and reduce trauma as time goes on.
Right.
Yeah, the post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, which is really remarkable, because that's not the traditional psychiatric model, which is, okay, we found this thing that's going to repair this one narrow little circuit, and you're going to have to take this forever. And if you ever do want to get off it, it's going to be a real pain in the ass. You know what I mean? Yeah. And that's the traditional model. And then all of a sudden, this medicine comes along in conjunction with the therapy, and it's, okay, you do it a couple times, and then not only do you not have to do it anymore, you're going to continue to get better.
Yeah.
That's where the minds should be getting blown everywhere, all across the psychiatric field.
And they don't need to take it again.
Yeah.
They have their skills that they've learned, and they start to use their skills because they couldn't use their skills before because they had PTSD and they had so many symptoms. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How is it working? What is going on? What's the mechanism of action here? How is this happening?
Well, we've been studying whether it works much more than how it works. We're obviously interested in how it works, but for the purpose of nonprofit drug development, what the FDA cares about is whether it works.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have less information about how, but we have a lot of ideas about how.
What's your best one?
Maybe the most straightforward one, anyway, that's, I think, a big part of it, only part of the picture, but a big part is it, decreases activity in the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, which in people with PTSD, there's too much activity in the fear center and not enough activity in the prefrontal cortex, the higher processing areas. Right. And MDMA does the opposite of that. It decreases activity in the fear center, increases activity in the prefrontal cortex. So it allows people to suddenly have the fear. They're not cut off from their emotions, but the fear is modulated enough so that they're able to reprocess the trauma in a much different way without being either overwhelmed by emotion or cut off, emotionally numb. Because those are the two extremes that happen in PTSD. People get triggered and the emotions are overwhelming and they can't really process things adequately, or they're so internally avoidant that they're cut off from the feelings and then they can't really process the feelings.
Yeah.
So MDMA kind of gives this window in between of a period of time when sometimes it's called the optimal arousal zone or the window of tolerance, where they can reprocess the trauma. I think that's a big part of it. And then when that memory comes up and suddenly people are able to manage it, they're not overwhelmed, then when it gets reconsolidated, memories get, after they come up, they get restored. When it gets reconsolidated, it's associated with a situation in which it was safe and manageable and supportive rather than all the fear from the original.
Yeah, so it's a bit like the mind and the memory is like a rewritable floppy disk, to use the old terminology. Probably some people listening to this podcast are like, what the fuck is a floppy disk? But, or a rewritable CD also, these things where it has this codes of information, these bits that are of information, and then you have the opportunity to re-encode that. So these memories, these traumatic memories, are stored not only with the memory of actually what happened, but the most important thing to the body is the emotion that occurred and happened during this, because that's what's going to guide future action. That's the translation into, should I be afraid of this or should I not be afraid? And when you have a memory that's soaked in these deeply traumatic emotions, and then that creates this kind of pattern in the brain that's really challenging. And then if you go in there and re-access that same memory, but you're in such a positive kind of, the only real way that I know how to describe it is like a heart-centered, loving, safe state from the MDMA. You're re-accessing that memory, but you have a totally different emotional state that you're accessing it in. And then so the trauma of that, the emotional condition of that memory starts to get rewritten slightly with the new state that you're in, and so when it gets stored back into the brain, it's no longer, soaked through with all that emotional trauma. It also has this, rewritten, hey, everything's going to be all right when I access that memory.
And a number of the veterans have used the analogy of going through the file system and processing what's in the file and then putting that file in the filing cabinet where it belongs. And so I think part of it is also putting it in the past where it actually is, or it isn't happening now, but it feels like it's happening now. So that's part of it. After the processing of the memory, it's put where it needs to be. And then it also catalyzes this incredible process of healing for people that happens after the session. And it's so individualistic how it happens, but individualized how it happens. But what needs to happen in the body is happening. Any kind of things that are stored in the body are there, and you can work with those. And then work with the process and the emotions, and actually living with the emotions again. Because so many of the people are cut off from their emotions when they have PTSD. They either, like Michael said, numb out and can't feel feelings because of the trauma. And that shuts out all the good, joyful memories, joyful times.
Yeah, it makes sense. Something is that traumatic, and then you can't really cut off only that emotional memory. You have to cut off all emotions. Let me separate from my emotional body entirely, and that'll offer some layer of defense there.
And that's usually really surprising for people. Oh yeah, the good memories are cut off. I don't even have access to those. Interesting. Now, is it, as far as a lot of people would describe MDMA as serotonergic? Is that anything that do you guys use that kind of terminology? Is this serotonin generating, or does it just kind of feel like that, or is that kind of like a misnomer?
No, that is a major part of the effect. There's serotonin release, decreased serotonin reuptake. There's actually some direct effect on serotonin receptors. So that is a big part of it, but it's very complicated because there are also norepinephrine and dopamine. There are hormones a number of hormones that are increased, prolactin and oxytocin in particular. There are other neurotransmitters, so it's what's called a very dirty drug. It's not a pure serotonin drug at all.
So it's just this kind of ideal Long Island iced tea cocktail of all the best feelings that we can get, really. I mean, because you just went through the list of, if I'm checking the box of all the things I want in a cocktail, that's pretty much a lot of them.
Well, it seems to be a good mixture.
Seems to be. Now,
But it doesn't always make people feel good.
True.
True. I mean, that's the other part of it with PTSD. That hopefully there will be some time during the session where they feel good.
Well, they're also you're guiding them into the darkest spots too at the same point, right? Like this is part of the work is to, we're not just hanging out and having fun here. We're going, this is work, pack your lunch bag, everybody, because we're clocking in here.
Right.
And, you better be ready to access the same with any psychedelic, really. I mean, that's the name of the game. There's the escapism version where you can go trying to find some pretty lights and a few, different dance moves, but then there's also the work version, and that's where the real healing, and that's where you call it medicine versus a drug.
Yeah. And that's part of the preparation is to really talk to people about, it's not like good trip versus bad trip.
Yeah.
You probably will have some affirming experiences that might be really important, but you're also probably going to have some really difficult experiences, and that's not a bad thing, even though it's challenging. It's all about being able to move into and move through the difficulty rather than moving away from it.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite stories with the people that you guys have worked with? Do you guys work together with people?
Yeah. Well, probably one of the best stories is the first person. Michael and I had not obviously done this work before. We'd done breath work with people and had been with
on Stan Groff's holotropic.
Yeah, we both were trained
method?
in that, and we led groups for 10 years. And then we also worked with people in the office together. But so our first person said that she was like had never taken any psychedelics and
Never thought she would,
but really was suffering and had a lot of depersonalization where she couldn't feel happy. She knew she had a loving family and husband, but she really couldn't feel that. And which is a kind of dissociation, right, Michael? Yeah. And she came to us and she said, I'd do anything. I'd be willing to go to Tibet to heal. And I don't think she really had that concept of what that meant, going to Tibet, but that was her comment.
It meant I've tried everything.
I'll travel anywhere.
I've tried therapy. I'm desperate.
Yeah.
I'll do anything.
Well, you're going to go somewhere a lot farther and deeper than Tibet, and it's going to be in your heart.
Her first experience, she got randomized. So it was our first person, our first experience. She got randomized to 125 milligrams of full dose. And as the medicine was coming on, she just smiled and lifted up her eye shades and said, I guess I won't be having to go to Tibet.
She could just tell immediately.
So she just knew.
Yeah.
Like, she hadn't even processed anything. But there's like this inner healing intelligence that knew she was on the right track.
And it wasn't like that was the end of the story. She
Right.
then went on to do some painful processing and revisiting the rape. But it was so remarkable that she just somehow knew she was going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That must have been such a cool moment for you guys.
Really cool moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was for us too.
Yeah.
We're wondering, how is this going to go anyway?
Yeah.
Our first person.
Right.
So
Yeah.
we got some reassurance immediately too.
And how many of these transformations like that have you been able to witness?
Yeah, each person has been unique in how they've transformed. I think, there's so many, you can talk about some of them too, Michael, but there are just so many moments where it's knowing how people have transformed, but when you're with the new person, you're not sure. How is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? You hope it's going to happen. And then seeing things change in these remarkable ways that aren't always showing up on the scores that you're doing, like the CAP score.
Right.
There's so many changes that are happening that aren't showing up there. It's like a family,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got to, there was that, I think 25th, or maybe the number is wrong, but some anniversary dinner out here where a couple
the
of
30th,
them, the 30th, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Where a couple got to speak, and it's just so moving to hear their stories. And you guys are always great about playing different videos and showing these different experiences and just watching people go through this. I have to sympathize not only with the people who are suffering, but also the compassionate psychiatrists and psychologists who've been trying to work with people who are so traumatized, but they just don't have the tools. It's like trying to be a great surgeon and all you got is like flint equipment. You're like, oh, flint again. Like if I only had a scalpel, I could do so much more work. If I had, if I was able to, and it's just now it feels like with psilocybin and MDMA, all of a sudden, the compassionate doctors have the tools to actually start doing the work that they really have, wanted to dedicate their life to do.
Yeah. And we hear that all the time from, experienced psychiatrists, psychologists, other therapists that come to the training.
Yeah.
And we watch a lot of videos and we talk about how we approach it and what, they see the impact of what can happen. And people are brought to tears about, like, this is why I went into psychiatry. This is why I became a therapist, but it's been so painful because I haven't really been able to help people the way I wanted, and now I see there's a way. So it's actually been really healing for a lot of the therapists.
I'm sure. I mean, imagine that you're trying so hard, and then at a certain point, you just have to accept the fact that you're not really able to do as much as you wanted to do, and that's got to really be difficult. And then all of a sudden this new way goes and you're like, whoa, now we can start really doing some work. Because otherwise it's like, with all of the psychological disorders that are continuing to progress in our country, it's like we're in the Titanic and it's sinking and everybody's got little pots and we're trying to bail things out with little pots. And now all of a sudden we got whole different system. We got bilge pumps and we got things that really can start to move the sinkage out of the way.
Yeah.
That's a good analogy because it's not as if the current therapies don't have any basis to them or that they can't be helpful.
Yeah.
They're trying to do something useful, like bailing with a pod is a good intention and
better than not bailing at all.
But it's just way too slow.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I've always liked, George Greer. I don't know if you've ever interviewed him.
Yeah.
You've interviewed George. Yeah, George.
Not on the podcast, but I had lunch with him.
He did one of the early case reports back before it became illegal. And we met with George Enrique, his wife, in the beginning when we were starting this. That's when we first met him. We went out to see them in Santa Fe, and we were talking to get their advice. And he said, there's nothing you can do with MDMA that you can't do without MDMA, but you just might not get to it in this lifetime. You could bail that whole boat with a pot, but it probably would have sunk before you got finished. That's the problem.
Oh, right. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and then, the frustration of like having over 1,500 people call for our vet study for 26 slots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, recruitment is probably not the challenge that you guys have
anymore.
Here.
Not anymore.
Because the data's out there.
The first study did take 4 years to recruit 20 people.
Yeah.
But just the number of people that want help.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking, really. I think it's actually gone over 2,000 now. And I've got some in my phone right now. I get a number, probably averaging 4 or 5 emails and phone calls every day of people wanting to know if there are any slots in the study.
Yeah, and it's not individuals. It's like husbands calling for wives and, fathers or daughters calling for their fathers and, and the way it affects the family. Yeah. The way it affects all the relationship. We've seen a number of people who, veterans especially, and one firefighter who couldn't connect with their kids, wanted so desperately to connect with that 5-year-old and those kids, but couldn't feel the connection at all with them. And then they did the study and they're suddenly connected again. And, what a difference that makes for that family.
Yeah.
One story, just coming back to the stories, one that I think is really remarkable is one of the veterans who had been in Iraq. He was an Army sergeant, and he got randomized to 75 milligrams, which the medium dose we were using, which turned out to be very effective too. And he had one 75 milligram session. And at the end of that, he didn't talk that much during the session. At the end, he said, here's part of what I got in the session. I realized I wasn't being honest with you or myself about how much opiate, and he was on prescription opiates for a back injury. He got blown out of a truck. He said, I wasn't being honest with you or myself about how much I was using and why I was using it. I was telling myself I was using it for back pain, but I realized in the session I was using it
for emotional pain.
For emotional pain. And the message I got was, I don't need anything from outside of me to change the way I feel. And that includes MDMA.
Yeah.
So he said, he came out, he said, and he started being able to talk about his war experiences with his friends and his family. He reconnected with his father. And he said, I don't need any more MDMA. So he dropped out of treatment. He refused. He could have had 2 more 75 milligram sessions and then 3 125 milligram sessions. But he said, part of the message was, I don't need that. But he didn't drop out of follow-up. So he came back for his follow-up 2 months later, and 1 year later, his PTSD was gone. His symptom levels were extremely low and stayed low at 1 year. So he was cured with 1 dose, and it just shows we're not creating MDMA addicts.
Right. Yeah, the tipping point between starting the healing cascade versus starting the, disassociation or the negative cascade, sometimes all it takes is just tipping that process to allow the mind to actually start doing what we're very capable of doing. Like our bodies and psyches are designed to heal, but sometimes we just need a little help to get back on track. I mean, but we have this paradigm in our head that, I think a lot of people look at the body like this really faulty system. Oh, he's breaking down, faulty system, faulty genetics, faulty brain chemistry, everything's out of whack. I got to get all these things, patch this thing up because I got this stupid human thing.
Yeah.
You're like, wrong.
Yeah.
I got this miraculous human thing that occasionally needs a little tweaking and a little help, but it's the most powerful doctor that we'll ever have is ourselves.
Removing the obstacles.
Yeah. Well, I often use the analogy with people when we're talking to them about their own innate healing capacity, which people are surprised to hear doctors and nurses talking about. I use the analogy of I did emergency medicine for 10 years before I switched to psychiatry in 91. And I use the analogy of like when people came in with a big gash, say a gash in their arm, and I didn't know how to heal that. All I knew how to do was create favorable conditions and remove obstacles, so I get the gravel out of there and wash it out, sew the edges close together. All that was doing was creating favorable conditions for then this miraculous or incredibly elegant and powerful healing process to take over.
Yeah.
And it might get blocked, like if there was infection or a foreign body or not enough blood supply, I could help with those things, help remove those obstacles. But I had no idea how to heal it.
Yeah.
And it always, I didn't think about it so much at the time, but it always moved toward healing. I never saw anybody with like a 10 centimeter laceration. And when I brought him back to check the wound, it was 11 centimeters.
Right.
It might be still 10 if there was some obstacle.
Sure.
But it was always moving toward healing.
Yeah.
And same thing with the psyche, as you're saying. So I think it's really true.
When you look out at the world in this kind of post-legalization, I know you guys are so in the thick of the fight right now. Maybe it's almost too much of an indulgence to look back to that. But when you look at that world that is very likely going to come to pass fairly soon here, 3-4 years, however long these phase 2s, depending on breakthrough status or not, and whatever factors, funding, etc. What does that world look like? How fast do you think this thing scales up? How many people can start to get treated? I mean, is this going to be a supply and demand issue immediately out of the gates that's going to be, and then how are you going to deal with that? And then where does it go from there?
You want to comment on that?
I think you can, honey.
It's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah.
Because you can see, like we're talking about, we already have thousands of people wanting to get in a study for 26 people.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the challenges is going to be to start training therapists, because we think and we hope the FDA is going to require people to have specialized training like we've been doing for the research therapists. That the clinicians should have that too. So once the dust settles of getting phase 3 underway, we're really going to turn our attention to expanding the training program. But I think it's going to be a big supply problem of trained therapists.
Yeah.
And that's one reason we're beginning to collaborate with some people at the VA researchers to see about combining MDMA with some other existing treatments that they have therapists already trained in.
Yeah, so you have a whole...
We can train them additionally to add MDMA. So
prolonged exposure, is that the...
Barbara Rothbaum, a researcher in Atlanta at Emory and Atlanta VA, we're collaborating with her. She's going to do a study with prolonged exposure plus MDMA. We're working with Candace Monson and Ann Wagner from Toronto on a study of cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, couples therapy, with adding MDMA. We're doing that right now with couples where one person has PTSD, the other doesn't, but they both get MDMA at the same time, and we work with them together as a couple. So that's another way. They've trained a lot of people in their method of working with couples. So if we can show that MDMA can be a catalyst for that as well, that'll allow more therapists in more places. So it's going to be a big challenge. I think it's going to change.
The other challenge will be how to get people that can't afford this therapy into a treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, particularly in the case of veterans, I mean, the insurance is currently paying $30 billion for this cocktail of 10 to 12 pharmaceuticals that they're just. Right. I mean, it's got to be a lot cheaper than that.
Yeah, definitely.
So that'll hopefully the funding will come through. And I also know that they're doing some work on AI psychotherapy in the military. You guys aware of that project that they have going on, where someone like an interface, a friendly female interface, kind of checks in, builds rapport, takes people through a few standard questions, and starts to measure some physiological responses. Do you guys see, and I asked Tony Bosis about this, and he hadn't really considered it, because obviously psilocybin also has a psychotherapy component, should that make its way to legalization. But the potential for, instead of human psychotherapists, which obviously is very nice, the human empathy and connection, and that, I'm a believer, will never fully be replicated. But it is possible to get perhaps the minimum effective psychotherapy through an AI interface, potentially, that's playing the right music based on the cues and the responses, and guiding people to, the memories, trained, of course, and taught by, the human practitioners, but then learning from there. Because at that point, if you nailed that and showed in clinical research that, that was effective, all of a sudden you have an infinite supply of available psychotherapists.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, that's a really interesting one. I'm aware that that's going on. I think it's going to depend on the individual. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really good that people are pursuing that. And I think for some people, I think I agree with you, the human connection is important, but probably not absolutely necessary for some people.
Sure.
So we have to really be practical. I think some people who have especially early attachment trauma probably need human therapists in that corrective experience. But other people that haven't had that kind of problems early in life, but maybe have had war trauma or some other trauma, maybe AI could help. I think once we get approval, it'll be possible to really research how to be more cost effective. That may be one way. Doing it in groups for some people may be one way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which, again, may be suitable for a lot of people, and then others would really require individual therapy. But I think it'll be possible to figure all that out. It'll be so much easier to research all that once we get it out of Schedule 1.
Yeah, and people have been working with biofeedback and neurofeedback and how to get in these states with what you're talking about, with music or tones. So what about using that for integration?
Yeah.
Having people go into a state that's like a psychedelic state.
Yeah.
But doing the therapy and then having that as a way to continue working, just like, yoga or whatever spiritual path somebody has, art, some kind of creativity.
Yeah. It's amazing to see. I mean, and I think it may actually ultimately become necessary just because I think there's the maintenance level, but then there's going to be the initial flood level. When this hits critical mass, and all of a sudden we have people who everybody's like, okay, the new game's on now, and I think to just get through that amount of individuals, having ways to scale this is, and I know you guys are working hard to, get as many therapists ready, and that's absolutely crucial because that's going to be the very first line. But the scale issue is something that's interesting to explore because there's so many people, who are affected by this, and it's not just the trauma. I mean, like with psilocybin, you guys have to pick one of a variety of different things to work on, and PTSD is clearly the one for MDMA, and now depression is clearly the one for psilocybin, but the potential positive results for a variety of other conditions are there.
Yeah.
I mean, they're there. If you had to look at, some of the other different areas, you talked about, the couples adjunct therapy, and you talked about some of these other, but what are some of the other major psychiatric or minor psychiatric conditions that you think MDMA might be helpful for if you had the time, funding, research to be able to study it?
Yeah.
Well, definitely depression.
Yeah.
In the second study, all of the people that got the full or the medium dose, their depression scales went down.
Now, do you think that's because depression is a downstream effect of trauma, or do you think that's because it just treats the depression, directly?
Probably both.
Probably both.
Yeah.
I would say probably
both.
Both. I mean, that's another research question to check out in the future. But I don't know if you heard Tom Insel and Paul Summergrad yesterday on the panel, but they were talking about, the mental health problem worldwide is so huge. We definitely need to be creative about how to address that. So,
yeah. Interesting. So now, anything like further kind of off the wall with MDMA? Any kind of hunches or instincts? I mean, you guys have worked with a lot of different people and seen a lot of results that, like, for example, someone in the psilocybin, I've had a lot of psilocybin interviews. Someone in the psilocybin goes into, all right, I'm going to quit smoking.
Yeah.
Whoops, accidentally I just saw God. I'm going to quit smoking. I found God and I quit smoking. Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
But that was like the least important thing that happened in that session. You know what I mean? I mean, do you guys see some of these responses that are like, oh yeah, the trauma, that's gone, but let me tell you about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we've had people quit smoking.
Yeah.
Quit caffeine.
Start eating vegetables. Yeah. Never had lettuce and tomato on their hamburger, and suddenly they love broccoli and peppers.
Maybe do you think that's because they love themselves more, or they're in some way they just want to treat themselves better, or what's that? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's part of it, but also just kind of open to new ideas.
Yeah. So we did the NEO with everybody, and that paper is going to come out, and that's about the personality structures. And one of the findings is that people are more open.
Higher openness, less neuroticism.
Yeah, it seems like all of these patterns of trauma create a certain type of rigidity, rigidity in thinking, rigidity in emotions, and fear is a paralyzing force.
Yeah,
it's, almost it causes everything to get a little bit petrified, and I can imagine. Yeah,
controlling your environment. As
you open that up, everything starts to become more flexible.
Yeah. I mentioned that work, the imaging work, in a number of places, but Robin Carhart Harris in London has done a lot of it with about the default mode network and the way it's in a way a more sophisticated way than just looking at where's the most activity, but like how are the networks relating, and like when the default mode network is less active in some areas, it creates the possibility for unexpected new experience. One of the presenters the other day was using the analogy of like if you're sledding down a mountain or in a toboggan and you keep taking the same track, it gets harder and harder to get out of that track once you get going. And that's kind of the way it is with PTSD, or a lot of ways we get stuck and suffering. And when you do that, decrease the default node network, as if you're putting new covering of snow where there are infinite possibilities. And you find that's one reason not being directive in the therapy is so good, because you never know. Suddenly people have this whole larger repertoire of experiences and realizations and things that can happen. So you just never know what unexpected.
Like a good snow and the groomers come in and give you some fresh powder to be able to go, whoa, this is awesome. I got powder again.
Ski over that way.
Yeah, for sure. To get this over the line, it's going to cost some money. What are your guys' projections for the monetary requirements that are going to be needed to get this done?
Well, that's much more Rick's department than ours, but he's estimating about $25 million to finish the first 2 phase 3 studies in the United States, which will be required for approval, and then maybe another $10 million for adding a European study to get approval in Europe.
And what's really interesting to put this in perspective, like people poured a bunch of ice buckets on their heads, and I think they raised a considerable multiple more than that for ALS, which is a great endeavor and a good cause. But there wasn't any particular avenue or pathway that looked that promising for that research. It's just kind of like, here you go, let's hope. Yeah. And then here we're asking for 25 million and we got a pretty sure path paved. All evidence pointing towards massive world shifting, paradigm altering treatments. And it seems like a lot of money, but it's really not a lot of money.
Yeah.
For drug development. I think people ask, what do you think the pharmaceutical companies think of what you're doing? And Rick's take on it, which makes sense to me, is they don't think there's any possibility that such a small organization with this small amount of money could possibly bring a drug to market,
Yeah.
So they think it's impossible, so they're probably not paying much attention. So it's not much for getting a drug approved.
And MAPS is an organization that is truly funded by just everybody giving what they can. There's no massive grants coming in. There's not money falling in from the sky. Like anybody listening now, if you have some money, if you're moved by this, if you know anybody who could be helped or touched by this, like this is the front lines of what we're doing. Like this is the place to give a little extra.
So many people at MAPS have worked for volunteering, not getting paid.
No doubt.
Yeah.
No government funding, no farms, no industry funding, no chance for profit,
Yeah, I mean, I really respect everybody who's providing food for the hungry and working on all of these downstream issues. But this thing, I think this is the most important cause we have, because it starts at the top of the pyramid. It starts this trickle-down approach where it's healing people from the inside out, and then not only healing them, healing the people that they're going to touch, their families, their spouses, their children. This is a multi-generational healing that we're potentially creating. And with that consciousness, with then activating them to become healers of not only themselves but other people, and spreading this kind of positivity that who knows what kind of impact that'll have. It's like the old analogy from, I think it was biblical, where it said, instead of giving someone a fish, teach them how to fish. Right. Instead of giving someone a little snack of something that might be helpful, let's teach them how to heal themselves. Yeah. And this is the front lines of that cause. So anybody listening, maps.org, maps.org. I'm certainly going to be dedicating a ton of my efforts to it. And, I really personally, and the world appreciates, and I know you guys do, all the help that we can get in this fight.
Oh,
thank you so much.
Appreciate it so much. You know, if it weren't for all this support, of course, we wouldn't be able to do this at all. It's really a community effort.
Yep. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, guys. Thank you for your service.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank you for your time.
holding the light in the dark times, and now, bringing it over the finish line.
Thank you for helping to shine the light.
No doubt. No doubt. Happy to be of service.
Yeah.
Much love, everybody. Bye.